Hello, my name is Katja and you are welcome to my channel. Finnish folk-style silk caps are peculiar headwear with a long history. They are an important part of Western Finnish folk costumes. In English, they are still classified as French hoods, at least if you believe Wikipedia. French hoods came into fashion in the 16th century. In the beginning of the 18th century, these had turned into soft caps, which were worn over a lace-edged caps. In Sweden, it then became fashionable to harden these caps by adding layers and layers of paper on top of which the fabric was then added. By the mid-18th century, these caps had become fashionable among middle-class women, like the wives of priests and merchants, and rich farmers. The caps were covered with expensive patterned silk fabrics. A headband under the cap was edged with a pleated fine fabric or thin strip of lace or gauze that showed under the cap. This lace gave the cap its Finnish name, tykkimyssy, where tykki comes from the Swedish stycke, that was the name of the lace bit. Myssy then means simply a cap. When the silk caps went out of fashion among the rich folk at the end of the 18th century, the peasant women adopted them. Due to the sumptuary laws, silk was only allowed in a small cap. Still, the colors and decorations were under scrutiny. Gold and silver embroidery was replaced with chain-stitch embroidery. The sumptuary laws also forbid the use of lace wider than 3 fingers. Nothing forbid clever women of sewing several narrow strips together to make a wider strip of lace. Among peasant women, tykkimyssy was a sign of an adult woman. Young girls would have tied colorful ribbons around their head instead. These caps were professionally made and embroidered. Buying a cap like this was a big investment. I have read that a cap might have cost the same amount as a whole cow. These caps were thus treasured and stored carefully and only taken out on special days. During the 19th century, the sumptuary laws became obsolete and women started adding more lace to their caps. Rauma was the capital of lace making in Finland and Rauma lace was sold around the country. The white lace was starched to keep its shape around the head. When amount of lace increased, the caps themselves became smaller. Askola cap is one of the smallest belonging to national costumes. Here is the surviving cap that the cap of Askola costume is based on. The silk has originally been red, but it's now very faded. The silk has been decorated with traditional chain-stitch floral embroidery. There are 6 pleats at both sides and the edge has been covered with a ribbon. The forehead edge has a small point at the center. Making this cap requires materials and expertise I don't have, so I enrolled on a course. Still, I was allowed to film my work, so now you can see how this cap is made. The first thing to do is to make some dry porridge. Why? Have you ever tried to clean out a dried porridge stain and it sticks like a glue? Exactly. And we are going to use it as glue. While the porridge is getting ready, I got my pattern drawn and then used it to cut 16 similar pieces out of old newspapers. I will also need 2 pieces out of linen. Then we can take the porridge and start assembly. First, you spread porridge on the pieces of linen. Then you cover those pieces with newspaper. Then you'll add more porridge and repeat this. It is pretty messy work. Now we have 8 layers of porridge and newspaper on the linen. The final layer is going to be this brown paper. Then we'll fold the seam allowance down. Now, without waiting for anything to dry, we'll stitch the pieces together using sturdy linen thread doubled. The layers are very thick, so a pair of pliers comes in handy. Final result looks like this. Now we can start shaping this thing. The seam is opened and pressed down. Pleats are added. Making tiny pleats is tricky. I was envious to the people that were making caps with only 4 pleats on each side as I had 6. A knitting needle was big help here, but I wish I had brought a smaller one. Now the cap is finally ready to go onto the block. I added 2 strips of cotton to hold it in place. And we'll continue adding more paper and porridge. This time we use thick lining paper in strips. I added 3 layers so that each layer is perpendicular to the previous one. Then it was time to take a break and leave our cap to dry overnight. The next day we smoothed the surface with iron. This also shortens the drying time. Then we could leave our caps for a month to dry in peace and start working with the cover. My cover is made out of this red silk satin fabric. I first traced the edges of my pattern on the silk and then started embroidering in tiny chain stitches. To make aligning consecutive patterns easier, I cut out my pattern and taped the tracing carbon paper onto the other side. A hole in the middle further helps to align the center of the pattern. I use a ballpoint pen to transfer the pattern. The resulting yellow line is faint, but I could still see it well enough. For these tiny stitches, I only need one strand of embroidery floss. I bought this oval embroidery ring from my teacher's recommendation, as it is easier to stitch tiny motifs when you can stay close to the edge of the frame. Finally, the embroidery is finished. It took me perhaps 2 weeks, but I didn't hurry with the stitching. Here I've got my cap base back, and I trimmed the messy edges away. It doesn't look bad. Now I'll add 2 cotton ribbons that will be used to fasten this cap to my hair. Before adding the silk, the cap is covered with wadding. A small amount of paper glue helps to keep the wadding in place. Now I can cut the silk and stitch the seam at the top. This is done with a silk thread and tiny running stitches that can be later pulled to help to mold the silk cover to the shape of the base. At this point, I realized that I had forgotten to add loops for my ribbons, so as long as the silk was still loose at the back, I added these 4 loops. The front will be covered with a ribbon, but I sewed the silk on with a few stitches to keep the cover in place while I stitched the pleats. Basically, one just stitches through the bottom of each pleat through all layers. When the pleat ends, the stitching continues a little bit as a decorative stitching that doesn't need to go through the paper. My silk was a bit short at the back, so I added this ribbon to make casing for my ties. A narrow ribbon is then sewn to cover the edge at the front. Finally, I'll add the few rows of decorative stitches that go around the edge. Now, I could just wait to make my bobbin lace to go under the cap, but I think that it will take a lot of time. So, for the moment, I made a temporary lace bit to wear until then. The small cap needs white piece of lace, so I combined these 3 different kinds of lace together. The lace then is sewn to a bone, that is this piece of linen. It is called a bone because of its shape. I hemmed the bone and then whipped the lace to it. And here is the final result. I'm pretty happy on how it turned out. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel, and if you want to support what I do here, you can always buy me a coffee through the link below. Thank you for watching and see you soon. Bye!